Soren Kierkegaard, Training in Christianity, Part 1, Section 2, Halt, the Obstacle. Subsection 1, Objections, 6 queries. Come hither unto me, all ye that labour and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Halt now. But what is there to impose a halt? That which, in a single instant, infinitely alters everything, so that in reality, instead of getting a sight, as one might expect, of an interminable throng of such as labour and are heavy laden, following the invitation, you behold, in fact, a sight which is exactly the opposite, an interminable throng of men who turn backward in flight and shudder until in the scramble to get away they trample one another underfoot, so that if from the result one were to infer what had been said, one must conclude that the words were procul o procul este profani, rather than come hither. The halt is imposed finally by something infinitely more important and infinitely more decisive, by the inviter. Not as though he were not the man to do what he says, or not God to keep the promise he has made. No, in a sense very different from that. In the sense, namely, that the inviter is, and insists upon being, the definite historical person he was 1,800 years ago, and that as this definite person, living under the conditions he then lived under, he uttered those words of invitation. He is not, and for nobody is he willing to be, one about whom we have learned to know something merely from history, that is to say, world history, secular history, in contrast to sacred history. For from history we can learn nothing about him, because there is absolutely nothing that can be known about him. In the footnote, the editor writes, in this paragraph, as in an overture, the principal themes of the whole work are suggested. It needs to be noted that they do not emerge here for the first time. They had been more fully elaborated in earlier works, although they are more tellingly presented here in the style of direct communication. In this and in subsequent notes, I refer to earlier works where these themes are more fully discussed. For the significance of history and its irrelevance for faith, see the fragments, chapter 4, and postscripts, part 1, chapter 1, section 1, and part 2, second division, chapter 4, section 1, subsection 3. The second editor's footnote writes, Kierkegaard's definition of faith was in part determined by its opposition to knowledge. For example, the postscript, part 1, chapter 1, subsection 1. He declines to be judged in a human way by the consequences of his life. That is to say, he is and would be the sign of the offense and the object of faith. In the footnote, the editor writes, the offense of Christianity is very emphatically dwelt upon later in this book, but it had already been considered in the fragments, for example, chapter 3, appendix. To judge him by the consequences of his life is mere mockery of God, for, seeing that he is God, his life, the life which he actually lived in time, is infinitely more decisively important than all the consequences of it in the course of history. Query A. Who spoke these words of invitation? The inviter. Who is the inviter? Jesus Christ. Which Jesus Christ? The Jesus Christ who sits in glory at the right hand of the Father? No. From the seat of his glory he has not spoken one word. Therefore, it is Jesus Christ in his humiliation, in the state of humiliation, who spoke these words. Is then Jesus Christ not always the same? Yes, he is the same yesterday and today, the same that 1,800 years ago humbled himself and took upon him the form of a servant, the Jesus Christ who uttered these words of invitation. In his coming again in glory, he is again the same Jesus Christ, but this has not yet occurred. Is he, then, not now in glory? Yes, indeed, this the Christian believes. But it was in the state of humiliation he uttered these words. From the seat of his glory he has not uttered them. And about his coming again in glory nothing can be known. In the strictest sense, it can only be believed. But one cannot have become a Christian without having already come to him in his estate of humiliation, without having come to him who is the sign of the offense and the object of faith. In no other wise does he exist on earth, for it was only thus that he existed. That he shall come again in glory is to be expected, but it can be expected and believed only by one who has attached himself and continues to hold fast to him as he actually existed. Jesus Christ is the same, but he lived 1,800 years ago in his humiliation and becomes changed first for us with his coming again. As yet he has not returned, so he remains still, the lowly one about whom it is believed that he shall return in glory. What he said and taught, every word he has spoken, becomes eo ipso untrue when we make it appear as if it were Christ in glory who says it. No, he maintains silence. It is the lowly one who speaks. The interval between his humiliation and his coming again in glory, which at this moment is about 1,800 years, and may possibly be protracted to many times 1,800, this interval, rather, all that this interval makes of him, secular history and church history, with all the worldly information they furnish about Christ, about who Christ was, and consequently about who uttered these words, is a thing completely indifferent, neither here nor there, which merely distorts him, and thereby renders these words of invitation untrue. For it is untruth if I imaginatively ascribe to a man words which he never uttered, affirming that he said them. But it is also untruth if I imaginatively represent him as essentially different from what he was when he spake certain words. I say essentially different, for a falsehood which has to do only with some accidental trait does not make it untrue that he said the thing. And so, when God is pleased to walk here on earth in a strict incognito, such as only an almighty being can assume, an incognito impenetrable to the most intimate observation, when it pleases him to come in the lowly form of a servant, to all appearance like any other man, and why he does it, with what purpose, he surely knows best. But whatever the reason or purpose may be, they testify that the incognito has some essential significance. When it pleases him to come in this lowly form to teach men, and then somebody repeats exactly the words he uttered, but makes it appear as if it were God that said them, the thing becomes untrue, for it is untrue that he uttered these words. Query B. Can one learn from history anything about Christ? Kierkegaard writes in the footnote, by history it is to be understood throughout profane history, world history, history as ordinarily understood, in contrast to sacred history. No. Why not? Because one can know nothing at all about Christ. He is the paradox, the object of faith, existing only for faith. But all historical communication is communication of knowledge. Hence, from history, one can learn nothing about Christ. In the footnote, the editor writes, the thought of the paradoxical character of Christianity, culminating in the paradox of the God-man, appears in the scraps, chapter 3, and the postscript, part 2, second division, chapter 4, section 4. For if one learns little or much about him, or anything at all, he, who is thus known, is not he who in truth he is. That is, one learns to know nothing about him, or one learns to know something incorrect about him. One is deceived. History makes out Christ to be another than he truly is. And so one learns to know a lot about Christ? No, not about Christ. For about him, nothing can be known. He can only be believed. Query C. Can one prove from history that Christ was God? Let me first put another question. Is it possible to conceive of a more foolish contradiction than that of wanting to prove, no matter, for the present purpose, whether it be from history or from anything else in the wide world, one wants to prove it, that a definite individual man is God? That an individual man is God, declares himself to be God, is indeed the offense, kat exoken. But what is the offense, the offensive thing? What is at variance with human reason? In the footnote, the editor writes, the opposition between faith and the understanding or reason was sharply expressed in the scraps, chapter 3, appendix, and chapter 4, subsection 4, and the postscript, part 2, second division, chapter 2 and chapter 5. And such a thing as one would attempt to prove. But to prove is to demonstrate something to be the rational reality it is. Can one demonstrate that to be a rational reality which is at variance with reason? Surely not, unless one would contradict oneself. One can prove only that it is at variance with reason. The proofs which Scripture presents for Christ's divinity, his miracles, his resurrection from the dead, his ascension into heaven, are therefore only for faith. That is, they are not proofs. They have no intention of proving that all this agrees perfectly with reason. On the contrary, they would prove that it conflicts with reason, and therefore is an object of faith. But to return to the proofs from history. Is it not 1,800 years since Christ lived? Is not his name proclaimed and believed on throughout the whole world? Has not his doctrine, Christianity, changed the face of the world, triumphantly permeated all relationships, and in this way has not history abundantly and more than abundantly established who he was, namely that he was God? No. History has not established that, either abundantly or more than abundantly. So far, however, as the first assertion is concerned, it is sure enough that his name is proclaimed in all the world. Whether it is believed on, I will not decide. It is sure enough that Christianity has changed the face of the world, triumphantly permeated all relationships, so triumphantly that all now say that they are Christians. But what does that prove? At the most, it might prove that Jesus Christ was a great man, perhaps the greatest of all, but that he was God? Nay, stop there. The conclusion shall by God's help never be drawn. If, in order to lead up to this conclusion, one begins with the assumption that Jesus Christ was a man, and then considers the history of the 1,800 years, the consequences of his life, one may conclude with an ascending superlative scale, great, greater, greatest, exceedingly and astonishingly the greatest man that ever lived. In the footnote, the editor writes, the argument from the 1800 years was demolished already in the postscript, for example, part 1, chapter 1, subsection 3, and Kierkegaard returned to the assault in The Instant. If, on the contrary, one begins with the assumption of faith that he was God, one has thereby cancelled, annulled the 1,800 years as having nothing to do with the case, proving nothing pro nor contra, inasmuch as the certitude of faith is something infinitely higher. And it is one or the other of these ways one must begin. If one begins in the latter way, everything is as it should be. If one begins in the first way, one cannot, without being guilty at one point or another of a metabasis eis allogenos, arrive suddenly by an inference at the new quality, God, as if the consequence or consequences of a man's life might suddenly furnish the proof that the man was God. If this could be done, then one might answer the following query. What consequences must there be? How great the effects produced? How many centuries must elapse in order to establish a proof from the consequences of a man's life, this being the assumption that he was God? Whether perhaps it might be said in the year 300 Christ was not yet completely proved to be God, something approaching that having been attained, namely, that he was already a little more than the exceedingly, astonishingly greatest man that ever lived, but there still was need of several centuries more? If such be the case, the further consequence presumably follows, that they who lived in the year 300 did not regard Christ as God, and still less they who lived in the first century, whereas on the other hand, the certitude that he is God increases regularly with each century. So in our time, the 19th century, it is greater than it ever had been before, a certitude in comparison with which the first centuries seem barely to have glimpsed his divinity. One may make answer to this or leave it alone. It makes no essential difference. What can it mean? Is it possible that by contemplating the consequences of something as they unfold themselves more and more, one might by a simple inference from them produce another quality different from that contained in the assumption? In the editor's footnote, Brands conjectured that if Kierkegaard had lived in his time, he might have been perverse enough to reject Darwin's celebrated theory of evolution. In fact, he did emphatically reject it in advance, as we see from this passage. Exactly the same argument was urged by Benjamin Warfield, who was my teacher of theology in 1890. In those days it was scoffed at or ignored, but in the end it brought that theory of evolution into disrepute. Is it not a sign of insanity, supposing man in general to be sane, that the first proposition, the assumption with which one starts out, is so far astray about what is what, that it errs to the extent of a whole quality? And when one begins with this error, how shall one, at any subsequent point, be able to perceive the mistake and apprehend that one is dealing with another and an infinitely different quality? The print of a foot along a path is obviously a consequence of the fact that some creature has gone that way. I may now go on to suppose erroneously that it was, for example, a bird, but on closer inspection, pursuing the track further, I may convince myself that it must have been another sort of animal. Very well. But here we are far from having an infinite qualitative alteration. But can I, by a closer inspection of such a track, or by following it further, reach at one point or another the conclusion, ergo it was a spirit that passed this way? A spirit which leaves no trace behind it? Just so it is with this thing of concluding from the consequences of an assumed human existence that ergo it was God. Do God and man resemble one another to such a degree? Is there so slight a difference between them that I, supposing I am not crazy, can begin with the assumption that Christ was a man? And, on the other hand, has not Christ himself said that he was God? If God and man resemble one another to that degree, if they have that degree of kinship and thus essentially are included in the same quality, then conclusion, ergo it was God, is nevertheless humbug. But if God exists, and consequently is distinguished by an infinite difference of quality from all that it means to be a man, then neither can I, nor anybody else, by beginning with the assumption that he was a man, arrive in all eternity at the conclusion, therefore it was God. Everyone who has the least dialectical training can easily perceive that the whole argument about consequences is incommensurable with the decision of the question whether it is God, and that this decisive question is presented to man in an entirely different form, whether he will believe that he is what he said he was, or whether he will not believe. Dialectically understood, that is, with the understanding that one gives himself time to understand it, this ought to be enough to throw a spike into the gears of that argument from the consequences of Christ's life, ergo he was God. But faith, in the province of its jurisdiction, raises a still more essential protest against every attempt to approach Christ by the help of what one happens to know of him through history and the information history has preserved about the consequences of his life. Faith's contention is that the whole attempt is blasphemy. Faith's contention is that the one and only proof which unbelief allowed to stand when it demolished all other proofs of the truth of Christianity, the proof which unbelief itself discovered, yes, the situation is curiously complicated, which unbelief discovered, and discovered as a proof of the truth of Christianity. Mighty good! Unbelief discovers proofs in defense of Christianity. The proof which Christendom has since made so much ado about, the proof of the 1,800 years. Faith's contention is that this is blasphemy. In the case of a man, it may justly enough be said that the consequences of his life are more important than his life. When a person then seeks to find out who Christ was, and essays to draw a logical conclusion from the consequences of his life, he makes him out eo ipso to be a man who, like other men, has to pass his examination in history, which, moreover, is in this instance just as mediocre an examiner as a seminarist is in Latin. In the footnote, the editor writes, Kierkegaard must have reflected that he, even before he became a seminarist, was a teacher of Latin. He was always ready to satirize himself. But strange. People are eager, by the help of history, by considering the consequences of his life, to reach by logical inference the ergo he was God. And faith's contention is exactly the opposite, that he who even begins with this syllogism begins with a blasphemy. The blasphemy does not appear already in the hypothetical assumption that he was a man. No, the blasphemy is what lies at the bottom of the whole undertaking, the thought without which one would never begin, the thought which therefore is entertained without the slightest doubt that it is applicable also to Christ, the thought that the consequences of his life are more important than his life, which effectively is to say that he was a mere man. One says, hypothetically, let us assume that Christ was a man. But at the bottom of this hypothesis, which is not yet blasphemy, lies the thesis that this notion, that the consequences of a man's life are more important than his life, applies also to Christ. If one does not assume this, one must admit that one's whole undertaking is nonsense. And since this is an admission must be made at the start, why begin at all? But if one makes the foregoing assumption and begins the argument, the blasphemy is fairly stated. The more profoundly one considers the consequences of his life, if it be with the aim of reaching a conclusion as to whether he was God, the more blasphemous one's undertaking is, and such it remains at every moment as long as this consideration continues. Curious consequence. One would like to make it appear that if only the consequences of his life are justly considered and to due effect, one will surely arrive at this ergo. And faith condemns the very beginning of this attempt as a blasphemous mockery of God, and the continuation of it therefore as a crescendo of blasphemy. History, says faith, has nothing whatever to do with Christ. As applying to him, we have only sacred history, qualitatively different from history in general, which recounts the story of his life under the conditions of his humiliation, and reports moreover that he himself said that he was God. In the footnote, the editor writes, about this frequent assertion of Kierkegaard's, I would say once for all that however shocking it may be to modern ears, it does not essentially misrepresent even the synoptic Gospels. It has been said that the result of the Unitarian controversy in America was a general agreement that the Bible is an orthodox book. More recently, the general recognition of the eschatological expectation of Jesus and his self-chosen title, the Son of Man, indubitably implies the consciousness and the claim that essentially he was beyond man, possessing what Kierkegaard calls another quality, an infinite qualitative difference. He is the paradox, which history can never digest or convert into a common syllogism. In his humiliation, he is the same as in his exaltation. But the 1,800 years, or if there were 18,000 of them, have nothing whatever to do with the case. The brilliant consequences in world history, which well nigh convince even a professor of history that he was God, these brilliant consequences are surely not his return in glory. But this is really about what they mean by it. It appears here that they make out Christ to be a man whose return in glory can be nothing more than the consequences of his life in history, whereas Christ's return in glory is something entirely different, something that is believed. He humbled himself and was swaddled in rags. He will come again in glory. But the brilliant consequences, especially upon closer inspection, turn out to be a shabby sort of glory, at all events entirely incongruous, about which faith never speaks when it speaks of his glory. So on earth he exists still in a state of humiliation, and thus he will continue to exist until, as one believes, he shall come again in glory. History may be a very reputable science, but it must not become so conceited as to undertake to do what the Father is to do, to array Christ in glory, costuming him in the brilliant robes of the consequences, as though that were the second advent. That in his humiliation he was God, that he will come again in glory. This is considerably beyond the comprehension of history, and only by a peerless lack of dialectic can it be got out of history, however peerless one's knowledge of history otherwise may be. Strange. And they want above all things to make use of history to prove that Christ was God. Query D. Are the consequences of Christ's life more important than his life? No, by no means, quite the contrary. If this were so, Christ was merely a man. There is surely nothing noteworthy in the fact that a man lived. Millions upon millions of them, of course, have lived. If this fact is to become noteworthy, the man's life must acquire some noteworthy distinction, which means that with respect to a man's life, noteworthiness emerges only in the second instance. It is not noteworthy that he lived, but his life exhibited one or another noteworthy trait. Among such traits may be included what he accomplished, the consequences of his life. But the fact that God lived here on earth as an individual man is infinitely noteworthy. Even if it had no consequences whatsoever, the fact is the same. It remains just as noteworthy, infinitely more noteworthy than all consequences. Make the attempt of introducing here the noteworthy distinction in the second instance, and you will readily perceive the foolishness of it. How could it be noteworthy that God's life had noteworthy consequences? To talk in such a way is to twaddle. No, the fact that God lived is the infinitely noteworthy, the in and for itself noteworthy. Assume that Christ's life had no consequences. To say then that his life was not noteworthy would be blasphemy, for it is noteworthy all the same. And if anything need be said about the noteworthiness in the second instance, this would be the noteworthy fact that his life had no consequences. If, on the contrary, someone says that Christ's life is noteworthy because of the consequences, this again is blasphemy, for this life is, in and for itself, noteworthy. No emphasis falls upon the fact that a man lived, but infinite is the emphasis which falls upon the fact that God lived. God alone can attach to himself such great weight that the fact that he lived and has lived is infinitely more important than all the consequences which are registered in history. Query E. A comparison between Christ and a man who in his lifetime suffered the same opposition from his age that Christ suffered. Let us think of a man. In the footnote, the editor writes, Kierkegaard is thinking, of course, especially of Socrates. His first considerable work was characterized by the subtitle as having constant reference to Socrates. This phrase might well have stood in front of the whole great literature he created, for he became constantly more and more engrossed with the figure of Socrates, learning gradually to know him better and to revere him more highly than when he wrote the concept of irony. Let us think of a man, one of those glorious figures who was unjustly treated by his own age, but afterwards was reinstated in his rights by history, which, by means of the consequences of his life, made it evident who he was. Incidentally be it said, however, that I am not disposed to deny that this proof from consequences is calculated rather for the mundus qui vult decipi. For a non-contemporary who perceived who this glorious one was after he had reached this knowledge by aid of the consequences, only fancied that he perceived it. But this I do not intend to press, and in relation to a man it remains nevertheless true that the consequences of his life are more important than his life. So let us think of one of these glorious men. He lives among his contemporaries, but he is not understood, not recognized for what he is. He is misunderstood, then derided, persecuted, and finally put to death as a malefactor. But the consequences of his life make it manifest who he was. History, which records these consequences, does him justice. He is now acclaimed century after century as a great and noble man, his humiliation being as good as forgotten. It was due to the blindness of his age that it did not recognize him for what he was. It was due to the impiety of that generation that they scorned and derided and finally put him to death. But let that now be forgotten. It was only after his death that he really became what he was, through the consequences of his life, which were indeed more important than his life. Should the same be true also of Christ? It was indeed a blindness, an impiety on the part of that generation. But let that now be forgotten. History has now reinstated him in his right. We now know from history who Jesus Christ was. We now do him justice. Oh, impious heedlessness, which reduces sacred history to profane history, Christ to a mere man. Can one then from history learn to know anything about Christ? Compare above under query B. By no manner of means. Jesus Christ is the object of faith. One must either believe on him or be offended. For to know signifies exactly that the reference is not to him. It is true enough that history furnishes knowledge in abundance, but knowledge demolishes Jesus Christ. Again, oh impious heedlessness! If anyone were to have the presumption to say of Christ's humiliation, let us now forget all that has to do with his humiliation. Yet surely Christ's humiliation was not something which merely happened to him, even though it was the sin of that generation that they crucified him. Something which happened to him, and perhaps would not have happened to him in a better age. Christ himself willed to be the humiliated and lowly one. Humiliation, the fact that it pleased God to be the lowly man, is therefore something he himself has joined together, something he wills to have knit together, a dialectical knot which no one shall presume to untie, which indeed no one can untie before he himself has untied it by coming again in glory. With him, it is not as with a man who by the injustice of his age was not permitted to be himself or be accounted for what he was, whereas history made this manifest, to be accounted for what he was. For Christ himself willed it to be the humble man. This is just what he would have accounted. Hence, history must not incommode itself to do him justice, nor must we, with impious heedlessness, fancy presumptuously that we know as a matter of course who he was, for no one knows that, and he who believes it must be contemporary with him in his humiliation. When God chooses to let himself be born in a lowly station, when he who holds all possibilities in his hand clothes himself in the form of a servant, when he goes about defenseless and lets men do with him as they will, he surely must know well what he says, why he does it. It is nevertheless who has men in his power, not men who have power over him. So let not history pretend to be such a wiseacre as to explain who he was. Finally, O blasphemy! If anyone presume to say that the persecution Christ suffered expresses something accidental. Because a man is persecuted by his age, it does not follow that he has a right to say that this would have happened to him in any age. So far forth, there may be something in it when posterity says, "Let now all that be forgot which he suffered unjustly while he lived." Very different is the case with Jesus Christ. It is not he that, after letting himself be born, and making his appearance in Judea, has presented himself for an examination in history. It is he that is the examiner. His life is the examination, and that not alone for that race and that generation, but for the whole race. Woe to the generation that dared to say, "Let now all the injustice he suffered be forgotten. History has now made manifest who he was, and reinstated him in his rights." By assuming that history is capable of doing this, we put Christ's humiliation in an accidental relation to him. That is, we make him out to be a man, a distinguished man to whom this happened through the impiety of his age, a thing which, for his part, he was very far from wishing, for he would fain that his human have been something great in the world, whereas, in the contrary, Christ freely willed to be the lowly one. And though his purpose in this was to deliver man, yet he also would express what the truth had to suffer in every generation, and what it must always suffer. But if such is his royal will, and if only at his return will he show himself in glory, and if he has not yet returned, and if no generation can contemplate without the compunction of repentance what that generation did to him, with a sense of guilty participation, then woe to him who presumes to take his lowliness from him. Or let it be forgot what injustice he suffered, decking him fabulously in the human glory of the historical consequences, which is neither the one thing nor the other. Query F. The misfortune of Christendom. But this precisely is now the misfortune of Christendom, as for many, many years it has been, that Christ is neither the one thing nor the other, neither what he was when he lived on earth, nor what, as it is believed, he shall be at his return, but one about whom, in an illicit way, through history, people have learned to know something to the effect that he was somebody or another of considerable consequence. In an unpermissible and unlawful way, people have become knowing about Christ. For the only permissible way is to be believing. People have mutually confirmed one another in the notion that by the aid of the upshot of Christ's life and the 1,800 years, the consequences, that they had become acquainted with the answer to the problem. By degrees, as this came to be accounted wisdom, all pith and vigor was distilled out of Christianity. The tension of the paradox was relaxed. One became a Christian without noticing it, and without in the least noticing the possibility of offense. One took possession of Christ's doctrine, turned it about, and pared it down, while he of course remained surety for its truth, he whose life who had such stupendous results in history. All became as simple as thrusting a foot into the stocking, and quite naturally, because in that way Christianity became paganism. In Christianity, there is perpetual Sunday twaddle about Christianity's glorious and priceless truths, its sweet consolation, but it is only too evident that Christ lived 1,800 years ago. The sign of the offense and the object of faith has become the most romantic of all fabulous figures, a divine Uncle George. The editor writes in the footnote, the name Kierkegaard employs is Godmund, alluding to Uncle Franz Godmund, a benevolent figure in a German story for children, which was translated into Danish. I allude to the wise and versatile tutor in Abbott's Rollo books. But though this perhaps is the nearest analogy in English, more properly American literature, alas, I know that nowadays the reading even of our children is so various that literary allusions no longer allude. One does not know what it is to be offended, still less what it is to worship. What one especially praises in Christ is precisely what one would be most embittered by if one were contemporary with it, whereas now one is quite secure in reliance upon the upshot, and in reliance upon this proof from history that he quite certainly was the great one draws the conclusion, ergo, that was the right thing. That is to say, that is the right, the noble, the sublime, the true thing, if it were he that did it. This is the same as to say that one does not trouble oneself to learn to know in a deeper sense what it was he did, still less to try according to one's slender ability by God's help to imitate him in doing the thing that is right and noble and sublime and true. For what that is one does not apprehend, and may therefore in the situation of today form a judgment diametrically opposite to the truth. One is content to admire and praise. And maybe, as was said of a scrupulous translator who rendered an author word for word and therefore made no meaning, too conscientious, perhaps also too cowardly, and too feeble of heart really to wish to understand. Christendom has done away with Christianity without being quite aware of it. Consequence is that, if anything is to be done, one must try again to introduce Christianity into Christendom. In the footnote, the editor concludes with, no proof could be desired more cogent than this last paragraph to demonstrate the continuity of Kierkegaard's thought, and, I may add, the persistence along with it of the same mental note of feeling. Previous notes have pointed out several salient thoughts which had already emerged in the Fragments 1844 or in the Postscript 1846, and are here not further developed but more briefly and pointedly expressed in the style of direct communication. Now, it must be remarked that these same thoughts persisted to the end and constituted the spearhead of the open attack upon the Church, 1855, the Christian paradox, the opposition of faith and reason, the possibility of the offense, the necessity of being contemporaneous with Christ, the vanity of the 1,800 years. Seeing that the total lapse of time here involved is only about 12 years, it might be thought that such continuity as is here remarked upon indicates no remarkable persistence. This would be true in the case of a sluggish mind, but we must remember that this includes almost the whole period, 13 years, of Kierkegaard's restless literary activity, which produced so abundantly and in such astonishing variety. Between Training in Christianity, begun in 1848, and the opening attack of 1855, we have a period which is relatively long, although it was characterized by a halt in production. And inasmuch as it is here especially that one may be tempted to assume a break in the continuity, an inexplicable cleft in the life of a conservative religious writer who suddenly launches a pamphleteering attack upon the Church, it is especially important to note that the thoughts which are trenchantly enough expressed in the conclusion of this section constitute the prime contention of the open attack, that Christendom has done away with Christianity, and that Christianity must be introduced again into Christendom. These thoughts were never more strongly expressed than here, but they were later urged more relentlessly and with more frequent reiteration to ensure that they would not be ignored. My one thesis, said Kierkegaard, is that Christianity no longer exists, and my task is to reintroduce Christianity into Christendom. His complaint against Christendom was that all are Christians. Kierkegaard was justified in saying that Training in Christianity 1848 would be seen to be an attack upon the Church, if only the preface and the moral were omitted. Bishop Minster saw that clearly enough. Others, having slight acquaintance with Kierkegaard's work and no understanding of his purpose, were naturally dumbfounded by the attack and were inclined to attribute it to a mental disorder.
We who know the works, and also the journal with its revelation of persistent purpose, cannot be surprised by an attack which was so long preparing.